Have you ever just stopped and wondered why islands seem to produce some of the absolute weirdest creatures on the planet? We're talking miniature elephants, giant rats. It's like evolution just goes a little bit wild when it's stuck in the middle of the ocean. Well, today, we are going to unpack exactly why that is.
I mean, look at this. It sounds like a riddle, right? On one side, you've got a dwarf elephant. On the other, a giant rat. And here's the crazy part. Both of these creatures actually existed. Sometimes they even lived on the very same island. This isn't some fantasy story. It is a real, honest-to-goodness evolutionary puzzle.
So, what is going on here? Why is it that islands seem to just throw the normal rules of animal size right out the window? You know, answering that question leads us to one of the most fascinating principles in all of biology.
To solve this whole mystery, we have got to understand a very specific principle that governs life on islands. It's this predictable pattern that explains these totally bizarre evolutionary paths, and it's called the island rule.
Okay, so it's officially called Foster's rule, but most people just call it the island rule. And the whole idea is actually beautifully simple. When a species gets stranded on an island, over many, many generations, the big ones tend to get smaller, and the small ones tend to get bigger.
So the real magic is in the why. Think about it. For a huge animal like an elephant, an island has limited food. A smaller body needs fewer calories, right? So being small becomes this massive advantage. That's what we call insular dwarfism. Now, for small animals like rats, islands often have no predators. Without cats or foxes hunting them down, they can just grow to enormous sizes and take over new roles in the ecosystem. And that's insular gigantism. It's really two sides of the exact same evolutionary coin.
And listen, there is no better place on Earth to see this rule in action than the Indonesian island of Flores. You've got to think of Flores as a real-world evolutionary laboratory, a place where these pressures push life to its absolute limits.
I mean, the cast of characters on ancient Flores was just incredible. You had these dwarf elephant relatives called stegodonts living right alongside giant rats. Towering over them, man-sized storks. And hunting all of them were Komodo dragons. It was this wild ecosystem where the island rule was working in both directions at the exact same time.
But maybe the most startling resident of all was Homo floresiensis, who got the nickname the Hobbit. Standing just a meter tall, this was a species of human that had shrunk down to adapt to the island. It just brilliantly illustrates how unbelievably powerful these pressures are. And despite their tiny size, they were still sophisticated enough to make stone tools and to hunt.
So what happened to the hominids on Flores is the absolute textbook case of insular dwarfism. Their bigger ancestors arrived on the island, and then, over thousands of years, the limited food supply just selected for smaller and smaller and smaller body sizes.
But at the very same time, the complete opposite was happening to the island's smaller creatures, which really completes the picture of the island rule in action.
So meet the Flores giant rat. At 2.5 kilograms, this rodent was an absolute heavyweight. With almost no predators to keep them in check, the rats of Flores just exploded in size, taking on the kinds of roles that might be filled by, say, a badger or a fox on the mainland. It's just a perfect demonstration of insular gigantism.
Now, you might be thinking, okay, but Flores was probably just a fluke, right? A one-of-a-kind evolutionary oddity? Well, it wasn't. And to prove it, let's travel halfway across the world to the Mediterranean island of Cyprus, which tells an almost identical story.
Okay, get this. On the mainland, you had the massive straight-tusked elephant, 4 meters tall, weighing a staggering 13,000 kilograms. But its descendants on Cyprus became the Cyprus dwarf elephant, weighing a mere 530 kilograms. Let's just put that into perspective for a second. The Cyprus dwarf elephant was less than 10% the size of its ancestor. It shrank by over 90%. This is truly one of the most extreme examples of insular dwarfism ever recorded.
And it wasn't just elephants. Oh no, Cyprus also had its very own dwarf hippo. And these were not the big, water-loving giants we know today. They were only about 2.5 feet tall, with these low-slung nostrils and feet that were adapted for walking and climbing the hilly landscape. For thousands of years, this tiny, land-dwelling hippo was the largest animal on the entire island.
So we have these two unbelievable isolated worlds, Flores and Cyprus, just filled with these unique creatures that were shaped by the island rule. But for both of these incredible ecosystems, the story takes a really sudden, tragic turn with the arrival of a new and highly effective predator.
Just look at this timeline.
About 50,000 years ago on Flores, the hobbits and the dwarf stegodonts, they just vanish, right around the time modern humans, Homo sapiens, show up. Now fast forward to Cyprus, about 14,000 years ago. The dwarf hippos and elephants disappear, again, right after modern humans arrive. The pattern here is, well, it's pretty undeniable.
So, was it just a coincidence? Well, researchers studying the Cyprus extinction ran some computer models to find out, and their results showed that a pretty small population of hunter-gatherers, we're talking maybe just a few thousand people, could have easily hunted the dwarf hippos and then the dwarf elephants to complete extinction in less than 1,000 years.
As Professor Corey Bradshaw puts it, the evidence is strong. See, these animals had evolved for millennia without any major predators. It was a specialization that left them incredibly vulnerable. They were probably really easy targets, and the main thing that determined their risk of extinction was simply how much meat they offered.
So, what can we learn from these lost worlds? I mean, these islands weren't just collections of weird animals. They were natural experiments. They show us exactly how evolution works when it's put under extreme pressure.
And here's the crucial takeaway. Islands act like evolutionary accelerators. Isolation forces rapid, extreme adaptation, but the very specialization that allows these creatures to thrive in isolation also makes them incredibly vulnerable when that isolation is finally broken.
And you know what? This process is still happening today. Back in 1971, scientists moved 10 lizards to a new island. When they came back just 36 years later, the lizards were transformed. They had evolved bigger heads to eat plants, and had even developed new digestive structures called sequel valves to help them process this brand new diet. That's evolution in hyperspeed.
Which really brings us to our final thought. These isolated islands, these evolutionary laboratories, they created biological wonders that we can now only see in the fossil record. And it really makes you wonder, what other incredible evolutionary pathways have we lost forever by breaking the isolation of these unique worlds?